Okay, it is 2:30 UK time, so it is time for us to start. So I would like to welcome Dylan McGlothlin, who is going to be delivering the first of our parallel sessions today. Take it away, Dylan.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. I am Dylan McGlothlin. I use he and they pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at Western Michigan University, where I primarily provide one-shot instruction for the humanities departments. I am also currently getting my Master's of Arts in Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies, which is how I got into this topic. This presentation is titled, Are We Really Stuck in Place? Affirming Critical Pedagogical Practices by Choosing Hope. So just a quick note on my needs as a presenter. I am neurodivergent, so I feel more comfortable keeping my camera off, and I will do that very shortly until the Q&A portion, and will primarily be reading from a script. There will also be a short break about in the middle of this presentation for a quick stretch. I also wanted to include a positionality statement to provide a bit more context on where I'm coming from with these ideas, especially as part of an international conference. I was born and raised on the West Coast of the United States. Though I've been reading popular nonfiction about feminist and critical theory and popular philosophy, I'm still very much a novice scholar in this area. And in my master's program, I'm focusing on critical pedagogy and andragogy, or adult education. As my first audience for these ideas, outside of my classmates, who are mostly K through 12 educators and not librarians, I would really like your help. So please let me know what I'm missing in terms of historical context, authors, works, etc. Also, are there any holes in my arguments? Am I lacking clear limits of my scope? Is my interpretation and logic sound? You're also the first international audience I've had, so I'm very curious if this feeling of giving up on critical pedagogy is also in your circles. So I have a few questions for you all. So please feel free to enter into chat, yes or no. Have you ever heard critical pedagogy being described as stuck in place? Wow, okay, I'm seeing lots of no's in chat. Ooh, but it kind of struck a chord. Lack of knowledge. Interesting. Recognize what you felt was the vibe. Okay, so this does seem to be kind of unfamiliar to y'all. I was also wondering, but especially since somebody had mentioned this is kind of the vibe, so what feelings do you associate with critical pedagogy? Are they positive, negative, happy, sad, excited, hopeful, frustrated? Ooh, moral responsibility, liberation, empowering, happy, but lots of work, slight overwhelm, desperate to do better, warm, fuzzy positivity, helpful, ooh, and terrifying. Ooh, frustrated, yes. Know what we need to do, but can't quite enact it. Yeah, so yes, there is a very broad range of feelings and emotions that come up with this. Yeah, frustration, inherently revolutionary. Ooh, I like that one. Yeah, feel free to keep these going in chat. I like the sharing. Um, yeah, thank you for sharing, everybody. I was also very curious of just, is this just something I've stumbled onto, or, but it feels very much like, yes, this feeling of not really, uh, not just all positive feelings is very universal here. So basically, here's the beginning of my fall down the rabbit hole into this. I was talking with some educators about professional development standards for public teachers in Michigan, and the concept of accrual optimism came up. Accrual optimism was coined by cultural theorist Lauren Berlant to describe our relationship to things we want. She says, a relation of accrual optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. So optimism is not inherently a negative thing, but it becomes cruel when the thing you want is impossible, unattainable, or out of your control. Cruel optimism is basically an abusive relationship with an idea. This immediately reminded me of vocational awe. So vocational awe was defined by the late Fabazi Itar as the set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that result in beliefs that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. Seeing librarianship as a sacred calling and the institution of libraries themselves as temples of knowledge is a cruel optimism. It is fine to have hope in our institutions to become better than they are now, but the path to improvement is slow, complex, and should not rest on any single library worker alone. When I looked to see if anyone had considered cruel optimism in librarianship, I found Seal and Nichols' 2024 article, Cruel Optimism, or This Time Will Be Different, where they discuss critical pedagogy in information literacy as a cruel optimism. It is in this article that this quote comes from. Eisenhower and Smith conclude that critical library pedagogy represents a profoundly ambivalent and even negligible practice, where at best, thinking might occur. Critical library instruction is a stuck place, an impossible practice marked by an unreasonable desire. As someone who is just getting started in applying various forms of critical pedagogy to my instruction, I was taken aback by this statement. Oh, let me get to that slide. There we go. So what peeved me the most was the part that said critical library pedagogy was a place where at best thinking might occur. To me, thinking is the whole point. Critical pedagogy is where at minimum thinking occurs. Thinking leads to informed actions, right? So I thought I was misunderstanding this claim because I didn't know where it was coming from. So then I went to the Eisenhower and Smith's 2010 chapter from the library at Stuck Place, Critical Pedagogy in the Corporate University, which Seals and Nicholson cite as where their concept of the library as a stuck place came from. It was there I found this. We take as our starting point a claim Lather makes, quoting Ellsworth. Not only is critical pedagogy in the field of schooling impossible, but teaching itself is also impossible. According to these writers, the entire educational project is paternalistic, and as teachers, we must come up against stuck place after stuck place as a way to keep moving within the impossibility of teaching in order to produce and learn from raptures, failures, breaks, and refusals. So not only is critical pedagogy stuck, but teaching is stuck, and potentially a cruel optimism in itself. So this sent me another layer of citations deeper to Ellsworth's 1997 article, Why Doesn't This Feel Empowering? Working through the repressive myths of critical pedagogy. And this article provides a thorough critique of critical pedagogy practices. Ellsworth's experience was trying to employ them in a course created in response to increased attention to racism on campus. It was a course that was meant to result in student-led institutional change. Ellsworth had attempted to employ critical pedagogy practices, but ended up being really disappointed that it didn't work out as smoothly as she had planned, though she did say that it was a great learning experience for everybody involved. I'll get more into Ellsworth's work later, but for now, this is just an introduction to the concept of critical pedagogy being stuck and overall just rejected as a viable option for library instruction. So I believe the view of critical pedagogy, and by extension, critical library instruction as stuck in place, is actually an illusion caused by four things. One, a misunderstanding of what makes something critical. 2, a misrepresentation of Ellsworth's works, namely her article, Why Doesn't This Feel Empowering? Working Through the Repressive Myths of Critical Pedagogy, in her book, Teaching Positions, Difference, Pedagogy, and the Power of Address. 3, a misunderstanding of the promises of critical pedagogy. And 4, not choosing hope. So before I get too into my critique of these ideas, I did want to emphasize that feelings of burnout and demoralization within librarianship are valid. Libraries and the larger institutional and societal structures have many issues. Also, the world is kind of a lot to handle right now, so I don't want anyone to feel like I'm saying their emotions are not real and warranted within our profession. What I am saying is that I don't think critical pedagogy needs to add to those feelings of demoralization. I am critiquing the idea that critical pedagogy is not a valid option for library instruction, not the emotions and experiences of the authors of these texts. For the first part of the illusion, the misunderstanding of what makes something critical, I'm going to provide my definition of what makes something critical. My definition is based on Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator and philosopher, and the author of the seminal text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed; Stephen Brookfield, an adult education and critical thinking researcher; and Michel Foucault, a French historian and philosopher whose work dealt with power relations. I chose these three because these are the authors that came up in my studies, and their approaches have helped me articulate my understanding of what makes something critical. I'm sure there's definitely more I can draw on, and I'm definitely looking into that, but right now, this is where I'm working from. So first, Paulo Freire. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire describes critical praxis as being reflection and action. This combination of reflection and action is continuous and simultaneous. Without reflection, you have empty verbalism, with no commitment to transform. Without action, you have empty activism. It's just action for action's sake. Another way of thinking about this is the two main approaches in the United States civil rights movement, the organizing tradition and the mobilizing tradition. Mobilizing is short-term, events-based activism, like marches and demonstrations. These are actions and words that do raise awareness of issues, but do not lead to long-term transformation. Organizing is long-term community development, like building up community systems so that when the word gets out that someone needs help, there can be an immediate response to make sure that person is safe and cared for. It also creates deep, lasting connections between people, which in turn changes a local culture. So this critical praxis can be performed by teachers through critical teaching methods and students through their engagement with critical content. Next, a bit from andragogy research. Brookfield makes it very clear in his work that adding the word critical to something does not mean doing it more intensely. Also, reflection is not automatically critical. For example, self-reflection is just examining your own actions. It can be done by focusing only on the nuts and bolts of the process without considering the larger context of one's thoughts and actions. Critical self-reflection means not only examining your own actions, but also recognizing power structures, how they inform our views, and questioning those structures. He says, for reflection to be considered critical, it must have as its explicit focus uncovering and challenging the power dynamics that frame practice, and uncovering and challenging hegemonic assumptions, those assumptions we embrace as being in our best interest when in fact they are working against us. Just as Freire's critical praxis is continuous, Michel Foucault describes being critical as a constant checking. In order to do that constant checking, he says, we have to know the historical conditions which motivate our conceptualization. We need a historical awareness of our present circumstance. This makes a lot of sense coming from a historian, but it's very true. How do we go beyond the nuts and bolts of the process to recognizing power structures without understanding the historical context of what led to those structures being built? You can't fully understand the state of racism in the United States today without understanding the historical context of the Black Lives Matter movement, civil rights movement, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, Civil War, transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, the beginnings of the invention of race as a social construct, how other groups are racialized. It's a lot to understand, even at a surface level. And I don't even fully understand all of it. And that's why being critical is a constant checking. Another aspect of Foucault's work that I'd like to add of what makes something critical is his post-structuralism view of power relations. Post-structuralism essentially sees meaning as inseparable from social context, with all categories being very fluid. A way of visualizing this is that things can still fit into boxes, but those boxes are dependent on the social context and are actually more like nets rather than like an airtight container, and their contents can move between those net boxes. So from this point of view, the way Foucault talks about power relations is different from what I've seen in critical pedagogy library instruction literature. Foucault doesn't describe power as being good or bad, just that it exists. He also sees institutions as exercising power, not the source of power. It's the underlying social context of power relations that can create the conditions for institutions to be built and then exercise their power. Those underlying power relations are ever-changing, but are fundamental to human existence. So to summarize, my use of the term critical is a combination of Brookfield, Freire, and Foucault, and has three components. First, an understanding of the historical and present-day context of systems of power. Second, a reflection of how those structures inform one's own view of the world. And third, a questioning of those systems of power and the views they promote. All three need to be present for something to truly qualify as critical. And each one of these components extremely complex and layered. It makes anything critical continuous, ongoing, never-ending. It requires a constant checking. It cannot be completed. So now that we have a definition of what makes something critical, let's go back to those texts that I mentioned at the very beginning. So again, here's that quote that started me down that rabbit hole. We take as our starting point a claim Lather makes, quoting Ellsworth. Not only is critical pedagogy in the field of schooling impossible, but teaching itself is also impossible. According to these writers, the entire educational project is paternalistic, and as teachers, we must come up against stuck place after stuck place as a way to keep moving within the impossibility of teaching in order to produce and learn from raptures, failures, breaks, and refusals. There's a line from Lather's original words that I think adds a lot of clarity here. So the original quote started off with, implementing critical pedagogy in the field of schooling is impossible. That's the same, but this line right here. This is precisely the task, to situate the experience of impossibility as an enabling site for working through aporias. So I had to look up aporias, so I thought I'd provide a definition here too. From my understanding, aporia is a state of confusion. It's an emotional response, while paradox is a true contradiction. A paradox can cause aporia, a paradox causes aporia, full stop. But an aporia can occur without a paradox. Another way of describing this was that aporia deals with brushing up against the limits of human understanding, while a true paradox is an impossibility because of its contradiction. If you've read Catabasis by R.F. Kuang, there's a lot of visuals as to how a true paradox works and to how it leads to aporia. And basically the magic system in that book is kind of pushing past those limits of human understanding. Highly recommend that. Anyway, aporia and paradox are often used as synonyms outside of philosophy, which is adding to all this confusion here. So I'm going to try to be very intentional when I use these two words. I think the intention in this statement here is that critical pedagogy and teaching in general creates feelings of aporia, which can be used to come up with new ideas. It gives the illusion of being stuck, but it's really more friction than an arrestment of motion. So, if the stuckness of critical pedagogy is actually more a state of friction that is essential to the process of idea generation and moving forward, is it really a cruel optimism anymore? Another example of an educational paradox is from queer civil rights activist James Baldwin's address to teachers in 1963. He said, "The paradox of education is precisely this. As one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then learn to live with those questions, is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really, ideally want is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish." I turn to this because Baldwin is addressing critical pedagogy here, the examination of society and questioning it. It is also another misuse of the term paradox. So, society wants educated citizens. Educated citizens question society. Society does not want citizens to question it. Therefore, society does not want educated citizens. This is a paradox, but only if you see that final statement as true and permanent. Ferrer says the goal of critical pedagogy is to liberate both the oppressed and the oppressors, essentially changing the culture of society. This eliminates the paradox of society wanting educated citizens, but also not actually wanting educated citizens. This changes the equation to society wants educated citizens. Educated citizens question society. Society encourages and welcomes those questions. So going back to Ellsworth's work, her use of the term paradox in her 1997 book is again a misuse of the term and a major contributor to why her words are often used as supporting the idea that critical pedagogy is a hopeless endeavor within higher education. This passage shows the post-structuralist nature of critical pedagogy thinking. Remember back to how I described post-structuralism as things going into boxes, but those boxes are more like nets and things are constantly flowing in and out of them? Ellsworth really taps into that here. This passage also addresses what seems to be a misunderstanding of what critical pedagogy promises. What causes critical pedagogy to feel like a cruel optimism is believing that there is an endpoint and that critical pedagogy will eliminate the power difference between student and teacher. But there is no endpoint. There is also no way to eliminate power differences because, going back to Foucault, power relations will always exist. They're not good or bad, they just are. Ellsworth addressed this by saying, to deconstruct the teacher-student binary, then, is to refuse its hierarchy. Reinscribing teacher and student means keeping both the old and new hierarchies off balance. Rewriting the teacher-student relation in this way means refusing to let the question of the teacher-student relation be settled. It means working in and through the oscillating space of difference between teacher and student as positions within a structure of relations. And it's in that space of difference between that a new concept of the teacher-student relation erupts. But paradoxically, again, it's a new concept that refuses to settle into any single meaning. Essentially, when one system or hierarchy is deconstructed, we want to fill it with another. Critical pedagogy asks us to continually question those systems and allow the flexibility of roles within those power systems. To summarize, putting Ellsworth back into context, her works have been negatively framed as showing that schooling, teaching, and critical pedagogy are impossible to resolve paradoxes. But these are not paradoxes, but actually feelings of aporia. They are brushing up against the limits of human understanding. There is also a misunderstanding of the perceived promise of critical pedagogy, equality between teachers and students. Her work addresses this and shows the actual promise of critical pedagogy, keeping the student-teacher hierarchy off balance. So that was a lot. So I'm going to mute, take a little stretch break for a second, and I would also invite any questions or comments at this time. So now that I've stretched out my legs a bit, I'm going over what was happening in chat. Greeks have a lot to answer for, yeah. Ooh, good to see another R of Klong fan in the chat. Ooh, and a new article. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yes, please enter in if you're like, hey, also look into this. Any sources, definitely very helpful. Awesome. Are there any other questions or comments at this time? Are you ready to keep going? Okay. Let us continue. So now that I've gone down the citation layers to Ellsworth, I want to go back up one layer to Eisenhower and Smith, the originators of the library as a stuck place. Since I've been focusing on all the ways that I disagree with these concepts, I also wanted to include a part that I very much agree with that also touches on the emotional aspect here. Eisenhower and Smith expressed their frustration with the absence of serious reflection on how teachers are necessarily implicated in the oppressive formations to which they draw attention. From what I've seen so far, this is definitely true. Ferrer cautions against this when discussing how the oppressed have internalized their oppressors. An example of this is the myth of meritocracy, which Dr. Heather Ball had mentioned yesterday in her presentation. The myth of meritocracy is essentially the belief that everyone has what they've earned. The rich and powerful are rich and powerful because they worked hard. They're self-made. They earned their money. Of course, a poor person doesn't have wealth and power. They didn't work hard enough. They don't deserve to have more than what they have. Eisenhower and Smith give an example of this in academic librarianship, saying our counter-hegemonic work, which is critical pedagogy and attempts to question the system, results in our insinuating ourselves into more committee work, more classroom teaching, and ironically, the bureaucratic structures of the university. I partially agree with this part. I think it depends on how you frame the bureaucratic structure. In discussing how education has changed in the United States with standardized testing and universal outcomes for the No Child Left Behind Act, they claim there is a tie between education and corporate America's attempts to create workers in the phrase lifelong learning, saying, to what else does lifelong learning refer but the need for workers to stay productive by retooling in response to the demands of capital and changes in the modes of production? So remember, critical pedagogy and critical self-reflection is ongoing, continuous, never-ending. Yes, in the corporate lens, lifelong learning is used to mean continual professional development to stay productive. But it doesn't have to be a phrase just for CEOs. It can also be for critical reflection, being aware and welcoming to growing and changing. The same goes for fighting against and challenging hierarchical bureaucratic structures and ending up supporting them with your labor. This also fits within the organizing tradition versus the mobilizing tradition lens. The mobilizing tradition is appealing because it's straightforward and feels like change is being made because it's very visible work. The organizing tradition takes so much more time and is largely invisible work, or work that can only be seen through a big picture lens long after it started. Yes, universities have modeled themselves to serve a corporatized global economy, and academic libraries are part of that. But trying to change will require changing the culture, which means working within the current system. It's slow work, but it's work being done. And this is starting to get into the misunderstandings of the promises of critical pedagogy. So, critical pedagogy promises liberation for the oppressors and the oppressed, which means massive social and political change. That change is not fast or immediate, so it's very hard to see. This can easily lead to feelings of hopelessness in applying critical pedagogy to library instruction. But in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Ferrer never promised this work would be fast and easy. It's the organizing tradition, not the mobilizing tradition. I also wanted to note that as library workers, we have some social capital from that position, along with our education and perceived identities, making us both the oppressed, because we are not the top 1%, but also oppressors, because we are also not the bottom 1%. As Eisenhower and Smith said, educators need to reflect and recognize how we benefit from oppressive systems, even as we call attention to them in attempts to dismantle them. This also tends to produce uncomfortable feelings. But again, Ferrer never promised liberation would be comfortable. And finally, critical pedagogy promises a de-emphasis of teacher-student power differentials, not an elimination of those power differences. As Foucault said, power relations are inherent to society. They cannot be eliminated. They're also not inherently good or bad. Ferrer warns of liberation attempts resulting in just another system of oppression. Ellsworth talked of feelings of aporia when attempting to keep the teacher-student hierarchy off balance. There can never be a full elimination of the hierarchy. So before I get into choosing hope, I wanted to summarize all of this theory stuff. I said there's a misunderstanding of what makes something critical, so I provided a definition. Critical means understanding the historical and present-day context of power systems, reflecting on how those structures inform one's own view of the world, and then questioning those power systems and the views they promote. In order to do those three things, it must be continuous, ongoing, never-ending. It is a constant checking. I also said there was a misrepresentation of Ellsworth works that have led to this illusion of being stuck in place. This came from how paradox is being used in education. I clarified that paradoxes are true contradictions that result in feelings of aporia, but those feelings of aporia do not need a paradox to exist. The paradoxes of education that Ellsworth and Baldwin speak of are not actually paradoxes, but they do brush up against the limits of our current understandings, which can result in feelings of demoralization. Those feelings have led some to the conclusion that critical pedagogy is not compatible with library instruction or even teaching in general. In actuality, educators are experiencing friction, leading them to new ideas through reflection and action, which is a critical practice in itself. Finally, I said there was a misunderstanding of the promises of critical pedagogy. Ferrer said that critical pedagogy would result in liberation, social and cultural change, and would put the traditional student-teacher hierarchy off balance. It will not be easy, and it will be very tempting to fall back to the traditional structure. But it does not and cannot be fully dismantled, just challenged through critical pedagogy methods. Now, you may think, this is all well and good, but I don't know how this is supposed to help the feelings of demoralization from what feels like failed attempts at incorporating critical pedagogy in my instruction. I hope the theory aspects I covered will help with those feelings. And my hope for you is not just a feeling, it is also a choice. This is where my fascination with YouTube and popular culture gets incorporated into my research. So I love every project the Green brothers, Hank and John Green, have been a part of. If you need a reason to have faith that the internet can indeed be a good place, check out any of their content. A few months ago, John Green made a video titled, Hope is Not a Feeling. So you may have heard that love is not just a feeling, but a choice. And John says that the same can go for hope. So he does admit hope is a feeling. It is a very nice feeling. It has a reputation for being easy. But that kind of hope doesn't withstand the reality that there's a lot of suffering in the world. Hope is also a decision and a practice. John explains this by saying, hope is a decision that one has to make over and over again to believe that one, the world and those within it matter, and two, there is a cause to believe that things can get better for the world and those within it. Embracing nihilism, that nothing matters, it's an easy choice. It allows you to not feel guilty about an action. Choosing hope is difficult, but it also leads to more hopeful outcomes because it demands that you take action. Just as critical pedagogy is continuous, ongoing, never-ending, a constant checking, hope is also continuous, ongoing, never-ending, a constant decision. Critical pedagogy necessitates choosing hope, and hope demands critical pedagogy in order to create lasting change. So my next steps for these ideas is incorporating other authors and concepts. Just yesterday, I was introduced to the idea of futures thinking, which, from my very basic understanding of it, is related to choosing hope and how to teach hope, and it's primarily focused on environmental sustainability. I also want to incorporate emergent strategy, which is a philosophy for a way of being that was created by activist and organizer Adrienne Marie Brown. A lot of her ideas tie in perfectly with the social justice aspects of critical pedagogy and also the emotional work of it. It's also very largely based on Octavia Butler's work. I would also like to read Pedagogy of Hope by Freire, since it's a reflection of his work after Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but there's also a very brief reference to Foucault's ideas in that. I also think I could reorganize or change the sequencing of these ideas to improve clarity, so gladly welcome any suggestions on that. And this will probably be incorporated into my master's thesis, and I'm also planning to continue this in an education in critical pedagogy through an interdisciplinary doctorate in education and philosophy. With that, there are my references, and yes, I'm opening it up for questions, comments, and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was really interesting and also really educational. There's so much there that I think lots of us are taking away and summarized ideas really, really effectively. I'll change the settings so that folks can unmute yourselves. But if you do want to ask a question verbally, if you could just raise your hand first so that we can see. Or if you want to pop any questions into the chat, we have got some time for that. Sorry, Dylan. Your mic's just yeah, going a bit strange there. Let's try it again. It's a little bit robotic. Oh, now it's just go on, go ahead.
Testing, testing.
Yay, we got it. This is much better.
Oh, Then my audio got messed up. Sorry, what did you say?
No, I was just saying that's yeah, we can hear you clearly now.
Oh, great. I did want to mention that I know in my abstract I said I'd provide examples of applying critical pedagogy methods in teaching. I didn't think I'd have time for that. So as other comments and questions are coming in, I just want to mention another part that I've seen in a lot of this critical pedagogy literature is people make the distinction between critical teaching methods and critical teaching content. So critical teaching methods are basically techniques to teach, while the content is more of like what the students are directly engaging with. And I've seen that um, a lot of times librarians within our one-shot instruction think it's a little bit easier to just engage with the content and start from there without necessarily the methods, because the methods it's based in like dialogue, which I also learned was like specifically what they mean by dialogue is not asking questions of students to push them into a right answer, but actually having an ongoing conversation where there is no right answer and welcoming that. And that's kind of hard to do if you only have 50 minutes with them. Um, so a lot of the literature is pushing more of like, oh, just introduce them to this critical content. I'm actually arguing that it's the opposite, that a lot of times if you just introduce the critical content, again, because you're so short on time, it's almost very few things can come from that. In very many ways, it feels more of like that's that mobilizing tradition instead of the organizing tradition of like, oh, here are some people, some authors from, a diverse set of backgrounds, and then you forget about that. Or like, oh, hey, let's examine how peer review practices can sometimes perpetuate certain views of the world. But then we only spend a couple minutes on that and move on. And I would like to argue that um, critical teaching methods are actually a better approach, because even though they do take up a lot of time, if you do have that freedom with the instructors that you're working with, a lot of times that ends up with much better outcomes. And there's also a whole like ethical dynamic in introducing critical content without actually being able to dive into it as deep. So yeah.
I'm going to do the thing that I hate doing. I'm going to self-cite here. Just as there's a chapter that I really agree. I've had that same problem as you, particularly when you're teaching in a one shot. It's really hard in terms of yeah, trying to cover all the content, particularly when you need to cover set amounts of content, I think. And I think your point there about, also looking at the methods of teaching is really important. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So cool. But yeah, there's a chapter in the book that I've just popped into the chat where I discussed that. And there's a few other ones that I would really recommend as well. It's a good book. And it's open
Awesome. Thank you
access,
so
which is nice.
much.
Um, I was going to ask a question if I could, and I'm almost asking this on behalf of my friend who isn't at the conference this year, but particularly because you mentioned right at the start, you mentioned andragogy, which is Jess, who actually edited that book, is the thing that she's always wants to pick up on. So, is there anything that you found in your reading which particularly relates to andragogy and sort of teaching adults, which might be distinct from sort of pedagogy and thinking about younger people?
Yeah. So I actually took a class on, you know, I think it was titled, yeah, like teaching adults. And Stephen Brookfield is the author that I feel like has, well, because he mostly tackles with that critical thinking aspect of it. So I highly recommend checking out his work. But also, even if for anyone who hasn't really dipped their toe into andragogy versus pedagogy, so andragogy, adult teaching, and by adult they mean anyone who like considers themselves to be an adult. So that could include like a 13-year-old who is, working a job under the table, like taking care of a sick parent, things like that. In many ways, even though they are still seen as a child in legal terms, they are very much acting as an adult in their spaces. Um, so because of that, I also think that a lot of those practices can be applied to much younger students because I do occasionally get to work with middle schoolers and high schoolers. But a lot of what the biggest part from andragogy that I've been trying to incorporate in my teaching is this, like need to know concept where adults a lot of times, I think it also goes for children too, they need to know why they're learning something, not just why am I learning this specific thing? Why are you teaching it to me in this very specific way? So kind of going back to that, those critical methods of teaching, um, I've been trying to have like students, like when we're talking about evaluating sources, I give them a source, put them over in little groups, and I'm like, how would you evaluate it? And and a lot of times they'll be like, well, you're the teacher. Why aren't you telling us how to do this? Like, isn't this your job? And I try to be very explicit and explain to them, I'm doing it in this way specifically because, it's like I am curious about what knowledge you already have. I think you guys already know a lot of this stuff, but maybe have never verbalized it before. And that instantly makes them more willing to go on board with it. Same with having discussions where I put them into groups and I'm like, okay, talk to each other about your topic and then try to give each other advice of like, what database should they be using? Do you actually think they should be using Google Scholar instead? Why? Do you remember anything in class that came up with that topic? Do you think they could narrow their topic in any way? And again, they're like, isn't this your job? But explaining to them of like, I we don't often communicate our research ideas until we start writing it on paper. So being able to talk about it with each other, especially as people who have also experienced the course, you guys are going to be able to give each other a lot better advice and practice than I can from an outsider perspective where I'm just coming in for today kind of a thing. So as long as you're explaining to them not just why you're teaching them something, but why you're going about a specific technique, they're so much more willing to go along with it. And I think also the instructors in the room very much appreciate that too, because sometimes they're also wondering like, why are you doing this? I thought you were going to show them the database and we are going to do some clicking and stuff. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? If you want to either raise your hand or pop them in the chat.
Then I do have one more question for all of y'all. Did this make you feel a little bit better about critical pedagogy then, incorporating that into instruction? Got at least one yes.
You were preaching to the choir on my part, but I think I think it's really useful to have that restatement about, this is not it's almost like that idea of thinking about it is not a project that can be finished. And it's almost like it's not painting a picture, it's like growing a garden, that kind of difference almost, where it's something that you're continually working on and there isn't a end point or a finished state, which I think, yeah, I don't know whether it's partly because librarians sometimes we're often completionists, where we're like, oh, is that done now? Yeah, it can be really useful.
Yeah, in general, I feel like anyone who's kind of called to librarianship or even just academics is yeah, we want things to be finished. We like clear limitations. Like I even asked y'all for any feedback on like, does it feel like I have clear limits on what I'm saying? Um, oh good, yeah, reassuring. Um, yeah, but in reality, it's like everything is much more wibbly wobbly than that, and it is very unsatisfying to be done with something, but that that is life. Ooh, that is also another book that I just started the other day. Um, in a philosophy book club, we're reading This Life by um, I believe it's a Norwegian author. I can't remember, but it's like This Life, Secular Faith, um, and it's kind of addressing. yeah, faith and hope. And he means secular in the way that um limited to time. Like our life is finite on this plane, no matter what, if you believe in afterlife or not, like no matter what, our existence here is limited. And that limitation is a feature, not a bug of being alive. And so, yeah, it's kind of hard to he talks about like feeling satisfied or feeling complete with life. But even then, it's like hard to feel that completion, especially with something like this, where it's like society is always changing, culture is always changing. We need to continually question it, even if we do feel settled to some extent. So I'll also probably incorporate a little bit of that like religious philosophy into it eventually. Oh yeah, life, secular faith, spiritual freedom. Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Never assume we're never done.
I think let's say Callie raises a really good point there as well about what does it actually mean and that point about stopping and explaining our methods sometimes I think is really important. I think so much of teaching can be um, smoke and mirrors sometimes and actually just explain like, oh, this is why I'm doing it. Okay, right. And that I think helps, renegotiate some of those power relationships as well. Cool. Um, okay, I'm going to do a final call for last questions before I think we break up. And we'll have a few extra minutes on a break. So, last chance saloon, if anyone has any final questions or comments. Oh, Angus, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, figured out how to Zoom. I'm pretty pleased with myself. Um, yeah, I have this thought sometimes. Like, I was really interested in what you're saying about explaining methods, and I've worked in two different institutions where we kind of try and set the session up or set the room up so that we've got a kind of shared understanding about the way we're learning and why. And sometimes just been met with students to like use the Freirean terminology who are just so used to this banking model and they were expecting to come and just be told and shown and they don't know how to react. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about like just not the learners just not being ready for learning in that way.
Definitely. Um, I have also been in some of those classrooms where it's like, we're going to do this, and I explain it, and they also kind of look at you like, really? I guess. Um, and I think, because yeah, part of it, like even thinking back to myself as a student, that was also challenging to me. I remember the first time I had a teacher ask me, like, well, what do you think? And I was like, well, blah. They're like, no, 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 no. Don't like cite things, don't repeat things to me. Like, I want to know exactly what you think. And I was like, I don't know. No one's ever really asked me that before in an educational context. So yeah, it takes a lot of time to get used to those kinds of things. And yeah, so those students who have like, they're like, what is going on with this? I think it's always a good attempt. Like I'm always going to try in those sessions because yes, maybe, again, as like the guest lecturer just coming in, there's already that classroom culture that's been established by the instructor that they see every day. And so I think it's always good to try to introduce them to that and just kind of being comfortable that sometimes it won't always work and sometimes they're going to be a little bit resistant to that. But I think it's always um, we're doing ourselves and also our students a disservice if we don't try to expose them to those other ways of thinking and those critical methods. But yeah, that struggle is very real.
I'm glad to know it's shared by more people.
Yeah, definitely. That happens, I feel like at like one every three sessions, it at least initially comes off as like what is going on. I do think uh I do think in general, at least what I've seen in my area, there is a students want to connect, they want to talk to each other, and a classroom setting kind of softens that connection a little bit better than if they have to go out and participate into something. So by having a lot more like small group discussions, though initially they're like, oh my God, I have to talk to other people, like that does that does seem to help a bit because I feel like just in at least in what I've been seeing in the United States is just this need to connect, and a lot of times those methods call for that connection in a more structured way that I think is a little bit more easier to digest.
Out of interest, Angus, do you teach students in any particular discipline? Because I think sometimes that can be a factor as well. If they're from less discursive disciplines, I used to teach health students primarily, and one of the things I found was they were really would often almost be a bit disappointed not to come into a very lecture format because they spent all their time doing really hands-on practical stuff, and then it was like, oh God, I'm gonna have to talk more. But yeah,
I've seen it in a more arts and humanities focused setting,
so,
where you would expect them to be used to that a little more. Maybe it's because it's the library, right? Like, and it's not like core curriculum. Um, and I've also seen it in a kind of more STEM focused, health focused institution as well.
just
Yeah, it's one of those things where all of the yeah, oh, get it with social science students as well. Yeah, it I feel like yeah, their discipline definitely is a factor. Um, but yeah, there is just there are some universal things for every student. Um, yeah.
some. Okay, I think we'll wrap up there because we're approach. Yeah, we've got 2 minutes left, so I think it's probably best to stop there. But if we could all please express our thanks, either a reaction or in the chat, to them for a fantastic presentation, really interesting and a great facilitated discussion as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Awesome. So just while those are coming through, just a reminder, we've got another break. So we've got a 15-minute break before we go on to our next set of parallel sessions. Um, do take that break. Don't just sit and read your emails. You need a break from the screen. You need to go and look at a plant or a pet or make a cup of tea or something else. And we'll be back for our next set of sessions at UK time at 3:45, so in 17 minutes. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Take care.